Just letting a few more people in. I know there's a couple of you that have messaged me. Oh, yeah, we go. Fiona's in. I can see. I'm going to move this out of the way so that I don't get distracted by everyone's lovely face. Okay, we have a lot to cover tonight. We're going to be talking about discipline and what it means when we talk about things like dressage and show jumping and eventing and racing and polo, barrel racing, all of these wonderful disciplines that horses can do, but we don't ever really look at it from a framework perspective because we have this expectation that they are so versatile, and yes, they are, and they're incredibly giving, incredibly willing horses. And I think it's important to talk about this because when we start to see the frameworks that I've put up around looking at this from a very logical perspective, it will really start to make sense when, those of us that might be thinking, well, the horse is pretty well conformationally. I'm pretty good. I look after myself. I'm, eating well. I'm doing yoga, or I move my face out the way, doing Pilates, doing all that, and I'm looking after my mind, but something still isn't right. So tonight is that bridge. Tonight we're going to look at that. What is that bridge? What is that gap, that missing link that for many of us could be explaining why we feel like we're in a constant repetitive cycle of lameness, uh, frustration, a lot of emotional investment as well. Now, full disclosure, I am joining forces with another practitioner because we both have the same mission in helping and wanting to improve not only the riders, but obviously we love horses. We want to help more horses, and by doing so, we know that there's only two of us, and there's amazing trainers, practitioners, veterinarians, you guys, equestrian owners, riders who want to know more, and they want to actually know logical frameworks that they can do themselves, whether it is to help their horse, to help themselves. So we're joining forces, and this guy has an amazing brain when it comes to systems. So he's really helped with the system framework that I've put together tonight. So more to come on that. I'm really excited. So let's start with this question. How many of you recognize this? A well-trained horse, yeah, more than capable rider. So why does the partnership just keep falling short? Like, what is the missing link? So in this series, this episode, a webinar tonight, we're going to be looking at the framework to answer the above. So we've called this really the missing framework. So you guys will leave with some clarity. You will leave with something that hopefully will trigger this thought process in your own mind. Whether you're a trainer, whether you're a saddle fitter, whether you are a rider, whether you just want to improve your knowledge with your horse. So, this is the question that nobody is asking, that the industry should be asking, right? When a partnership underperforms, the standard response is to look at the horse in isolation, the rider in isolation. The horse might get the physio, chiropractor, the trainer involved, the vet involved, the rider might go to the osteo, physio, and separate, okay? Everything is done with blinkers on in a separate department. And each finds something legitimate, which we feel that sense of relief, but it might make just that partial progress. And it might mean that we go back to our training and we feel a very short-lived feeling of progress, but no one is actually asking this question, which is, what does the discipline that I'm expecting my horse to do or that I love doing, and my horse seems to like doing it, what is the demand on both those athletes together? And this is the key thing, not just always on the horse, not just the rider, but together. And I'm going to show you some examples tonight that you guys, feel free. You've got my email. I always send through a link at the end of each webinar. If you have any questions, message me directly. So we look at this as a three-element model approach. So this is the diagnostic framework for the entire sessions, three questions. So where these three answers align, where movement is efficient and the partnership feels effortless, and the results will follow. So, what is the discipline asking? The specific structural functional demands placed on both athletes in, for example, dressage. What can they give? So the actual capacity of each system. So you might be wanting to do dressage and you understand the demands that dressage requires from your horse and yourself. You might have that really clear, which is fantastic. But do you actually, and does your horse have the capacity as a system structure to meet those demands? And then what is actually showing up? So the observation in the arena, the movement response during training, what is actually showing up that we see as a symptom and a potential problem? This is what this three element model and these three questions are asking. So why this changes everything. When you look at what is showing up, you are always chasing the end of the chain, that end system, right? The lameness keeps recurring, the inconsistency that no one can explain, despite the saddle check, despite the vet coming out, despite the chiro coming out, the same thing is being looked at. All of these become solvable when you start with the first question rather than the third, rather than that third question, what am I seeing? You go into these three questions. What is the discipline actually demanding? Do I know crystal clear on that? And what capacity do I have, being very honest with yourself and your horse together? And then what is showing up? Most of us just focus on what we're seeing in the arena as the problem. So what your discipline actually demands. Let's go into this a little bit deeper. So, discipline as has a specific requirement. We tend to think of like dressage, racing, and show jumping all as different styles and traditions, but they're not, right? Each is a precise set of biomechanical requirements that do not shift to accommodate who you are, okay? There is a very clear biomechanical demand on every single horse and rider that does dressage. They each bring their unique style and they're each unique way, but fundamentally it's a box of dressage, box of show jumping, box of eventing. And we're going to go into this in more detail so that the dots start to join more clearly for you. So it is a set of specific demands. I really want you to understand that, both as the horse and as you, the rider, the trainer, the physio listening, the vet listening here today. So understanding this discipline as a structured requirement, not this stylistic descriptive framework that a lot of us, or these words that a lot of us tend to use. So another good example here is, say a horse changes careers, right? Many of us know the retraining of race horses, very big in the UK. So you've got a horse that was bred and trained for racing. Everything about its development from a very early age has been shaped by one set of demands, just one. And this is usually for racing, this maximizing forward velocity, so power, and minimizing energy waste, right? Explosive force, explosive movement. And when you understand that in racing, which a lot of us are probably nodding our head going, yeah, that's obvious. You see them on TV or you've worked in racing. From a structural perspective, that means that the horse's spine and the horse's skeleton structure is very differently, and the demands are very different to that horse's spine compared to dressage. Okay, so in the racing spine, you're going to have that very powerful spring, having the ability to coil and recoil very, very quickly. And then you look at the jockey, and obviously the jockey is a very different style of rider, right? And that jockey has a very different demands placed on it compared to the rider of a dressage or show jumping. So the jockey in the racing sense is the facilitator of this efficiency, of this powerful spring, and just to basically get out the way, I remember being told, having been a jockey and raced and been in racing for many, many years, traveled from UK to Australia, like I was told as a jockey, like your job is to facilitate. You do not interfere. You do not micromanage as I had to learn when I changed careers into dressage. Um, it's good to talk about this because we start to step away from our problem and start to see this as the bigger picture. So the discipline demands, in dressage, for example, really precise control, postural organization, stability, and the sustained collection. The basically complete opposite to what the horse has been bred and trained to do for many years as a flat racer. And the rider as well, from a dressage perspective, is very, very different as well. As we said, there's micro movements, micro managing every step, every stride, every change of head and neck positioning. Okay. So without mapping out understanding this, we tend to get a lot of what we call mismatches. And I'm going to go explain to you later on. You can kind of see where you might sit in this formula that we've put together. So here is, for example, just for those of us watching, a discipline comparison of the different areas we have. So we have dressage, racing, and show jumping, just as an example. I'm trying to take kind of opposite ends of the spectrum here to accommodate all of you listening. I know there's a few of you from different backgrounds. So for example, in dressage, we know the goal is regulation, okay? Whereas the goal in racing is speed, right? The first one who crosses the finishing line wins. With show jumping, it's power, okay? Then we look at that spinal structure and the demands of the discipline, okay? We're not looking at the horse and the rider now, we're looking at the actual discipline itself. So the spine of a dressage horse, the key requirement is stability. In racing, it's this dynamic spring, this recoil, efficient energy. And with the show jumping, it's the jumping over a jump. So it's from foreleg to hind leg and back and forth transfer the whole time. The spine of the dressage, the show jumping racing, is totally different. Now we look at the force type. So, for example, the force demands on dressage is very sustained, right? Compared to racing, you see this, and you see this now in a lot of injuries, repetitive injuries, because of the demands that are required for racing. And then we look at show jumping, we get a lot of these. I'm thinking back to injuries here that a lot of us resonate with, which is like explosive impact injuries. So the problem occurs when we apply the standards of one column to a horse and rider whose structure belongs in a totally different column. So hopefully now we can start to see this that, okay, if I've bought a horse that was bred for racing and has raced, whether it's hurdling or flat racing, again, two different spheres of racing, that the problem might just be occurring is because my expectation has totally changed on what the horse can do. And yes, we can adapt this with the beauty and the art of training horses. But if we just come back to the logical understanding that for racing, he's had a different goal. The horse's spine was had to function totally different. And obviously the force type expected on the horse was completely different to now switching demands into dressage. It's the same for the rider, by the way, which we will go into. So there is no ultimate single best way to move for horses, right? The industry has been built on this assumption that there is this optimal, correct movement model that every horse and every rider should be working towards. And hopefully you saw from the table that this all falls in a pot when you start understanding these different disciplines demands, racing compared to dressage. So they're not on like a spectrum of what's better and what's correct, because a racing horse that's winning and healthy and crossing the line first fast will move totally different and feel different in the trot canter compared to your dressage horses. So this has a direct clinical implication. Not only I have had to adapt myself as a trainer, treating horses as a chiropractor, physiotherapist, but then also looking at and working with amazing trainers around the world and looking at how they see the horses. And there are good trainers that are recognizing this and understanding that, okay, this horse has had to go in a straight line for most of its life. It only knows a straight line. Any wonder it feels like a plank of wood when you're changing direction or you're asking it to go on a circle. Like I'm being, obviously most of them can turn, but for those of us that are struggling with knowing or struggling to understand this, hopefully from the logical table, you can see the demands are totally different. So I'm moving quite quick, by the way, because we have a lot of slides to get through. Any questions you have, remember to just email them through to me. So 3 questions to replace this question we all say, which is I often get it out in the field is, and I hear this from vets being asked, this is this correct? Okay, let's just replace that question with these 3 practical shifts. So the first one is it appropriate for the specific task? So, correct implies like a universal standard. Appropriate tasks about fitting that, sorry, appropriate asks about fit between the structure and the demand. So this is this thing about, yeah, if we're looking at a flat racing horse trot and a dressage horse trot, and we're going, is the movement correct? Well, is the movement correct for what? For the demands of racing and for the demands of dressage. Key things to think about there. The second thing is the training tailored to the demands of to the demands of the specific discipline? Okay, so therapy trainers have to build around these specific demands. So if we know we've got a horse that's gone from a very from racing to dressage, we know that we have to probably start from introducing a bit of stability work. We need, before we go into strength and asking more from the horse, we have to probably go back to, right, you've moved in a straight line for most of your life. We're now going to slowly in walk introduce stability on maybe the right, on the left rein, and you start to see a little bit of difference before we go into, right, why is the horse not going on the bit? Okay, the third thing is, are these systems, horse and rider, actually working together? Are these horse and rider inside the discipline's demands? Are they aligned? So are they basically complementing each other and can progress very quickly? Or are they hitting a constant friction block, a constant compensation block? And to be honest, a lot of us, I included, were stuck in the constant compensation, friction issue when it came to me and a few horses that I used to ride. And now I know why. Sometimes in hindsight, the frustrations we're going through are the lessons that we need, even though we might not want to hear it. So, what dressage asks for our horses? It asks for the sustained collection. So, the ability to carry more weight behind constantly for the duration of a test. This effortless, agile, strength, but free flowing movement that we seek as dressage riders with the horse and the rider sitting very, very quietly. This is like what we are looking for when we're looking at dressage. So the training goals, these are not just um, can the horse explode forward or can it transfer the weight very quickly? It's slowing, dressage is slowing everything down for that controlled isolation micro movements and then start to build the stability before we build up the strength. So the question is not, can my horse do this, all the time in the warm up? Because let's face it, we know now from webinar 1 that horses carry more on their forehand. There's a lot of misconception, misunderstanding when it comes to the thoracic area of the horse. And then in dressage, we're asking them to have so much strength stability to lift the forehand up. I mean, generic here, lift the thorax up for this hind leg to come underneath. And it's a lot of strain, pressure, load on the horse as a discipline is dressage. So let's look at it from you and me, the riders, the trainers, the professionals in the industry that are wanting to improve the horse. Let's look at the rider for a second. So stillness in dressage is in the dressage seat. It might look passive and it might look very like, some of the riders that we look up to, they look effortless, but it's not a passive, just kind of sat there expectation of the rider. The demand of the discipline that the demand of the discipline of dressage on the rider is incredible. Okay, we have this, the rider is constantly absorbing the horse's movement every stride and returning it without interruption, right, while applying aids with precise timing inside a single movement. Okay, and that movement, then single movement, turns into a cycle while managing their own structural asymmetries so that it does not load the horse unevenly and cause a difference right to left, because in dressage is this, is the right rein as good as the left rein and vice versa? You can tell this is quite hard, and this is with every stride as a dressage rider. So most riders have or are training towards this kind of picture, but very few have actually been assessed for whether their structural profile can actually produce this constant expectation that dressage does demand on us as riders. So when the demand and capacity are not aligned. So traditional approaches, we look at things like increase mobility, release tension, encourage this greater range of motion in our horses. But the framework that we're working with today and that we're introducing today is let's ask questions. Let's switch into curiosity. So things like, is the reduced movement a restriction that is limiting performance? Or is it that the horse's structure stabilizing against the demand it cannot fully meet? Think about that. If the horse genuinely cannot sustain collection, then we get issues. We start to get little micro compensations of weight, low distribution. We might get some more tension in the thorax area. Then we might get, the rider might feel complaints like the horse won't work over their back, they're not engaged in their core, then suddenly stiff to one side. Okay. Treating the tension, the back, the core, the right rein issue, without actually addressing, stepping back and going, hang on a minute, this horse's structure, does it meet the demands of the discipline that it's required to do right now? And this leads on quite nicely. So I've actually put this example in here because this was a mare that I worked with many years ago that was that she did hunting for many years and then was brought to do dressage. Now, for those of us that we learned the structural assessment of our horses and what we learned about how important the central hub is, so this thoracic area here, that we can see straight away that this beautiful, beautiful mare isn't, I think she's from Ireland. She is is not going to find the change of career as simple and as fluid as a horse that has a different structure. You can tell she's naturally standing more on the forehand here. We have almost a high development of her croups. She's very a little bit upright behind. Now that is already causing limitations in the expectation of what she needs to do, which is now the career of dressage. And there was a lot of contact issues here. There was a lot of retraining that we had to do. And guess what we had to do? We had to go back to, okay, what has she done for most of her life? That is so important. Where do I want her to go? What is that demand required? And let's reverse engineer a plan to get her there in a safe way. So not every deviation is a dysfunction. So, and this is this thing where holding my hands up, when I first trained many years ago, 8 years ago, it was all about symmetry. It was all about finding and having symmetry. And my phone has so many pictures of horses' bottoms and postures and looking for perfect symmetry. Okay. But right now, and I've realized this, I'm going to give you an example in a minute, but we're looking for this. Some movement deviations are functional adaptations. So the system, the horse's system, your system, has this innate, super intelligent way of managing any demands that it comes across in its everyday life within its actual capacity. So intervening and interfering and trying to make it perfect and straight is in a functional adaptation can actually make things worse. So some are maladaptive compensations, so patterns that are building strain over time and eventually will manifest into an injury or breakdown. And that's the understanding that we have to have as professionals, is knowing that difference. And the question is always, is this pattern helping the system manage the demand it's under? Or is it actually building towards a problem that this system now cannot sustain anymore and we're going to get a lame horse? Think about And it's actually since coming to Dubai the last few years working with polo horses, if you look at polo as a demand, for those of you that haven't seen it, just watch a bit of YouTube. You'll see that they do everything from one side. Okay, the rider and the mallet and everything is hit on one side. Over time, and if the horse is bred for polo and that's all it knows, it's going to be what we would say asymmetric. But if we try and make it symmetrical, are we causing an issue? Are we causing a dysfunction? Yes. How can we not? It needs to be asymmetric for the job. So let's start with this. Let's start with horse structural types. So why structural type changes matter. So obviously we have uh, two horses of the same breed at the same level. Now, the same training history can have completely different structural types. What I mean by a structural type is that it shows you about the horse's skeleton, obviously the muscular, which we see superficially, the connective tissue, which we can lift up right fore, left leg and test, compare left to right. We can do all that's kind of the structure. But once you understand the type, the patterns that seem so random to start with actually have some logic behind it. And then these reactions that we can then um, have a framework for seem to make more sense as opposed to us guessing the whole time. So I've obviously put a variety of different structural types on the slide here, but I just want us to also understand that even though these are different breeds, you can still have three or four section Ds lining up that are the same breed but can still have different structures. And this is why I've definitely moved away, especially with nowadays, like with the sport horse crossbreeding that's happening, that just because it's bred for the job, it doesn't mean it's structurally it doesn't mean it has the structure to do the discipline, the demands of the discipline. And that's the key thing. I'm sure many of us can relate to this. So let's start with these five structural types, okay? So for example, you'll have a horse that has a structural type that's very dominant, so power dominant, and they might have this favored hindquarter force generation, okay? They're actually more suited to this collection-based disciplines. Um, Dressage, things like that, but also your racing. But then you also have these elastic speed dominant types. Now, they are your elastic recoil, your stride length. That's their primary function in this elastic speed. Straight away, we think of, eventing. We also think of show jumping, but, we can also think of more racing here. Definitely not your dressage type. Now, this is where we go more into that dressage because we're looking at the structural stability. So these will be things like can weight shift right forehand to hind quarters quite easily. They're very stable and structure in their spinal column. This will be good for things like dressage, like your lateral work. So that mare I showed you earlier on, you could tell she was more of the power dominant type. She had come from hunting, then compared to what she now had to change her structural type altogether and go into dressage, go into more of this stability. And then we have these like quite agile, multi-directional structures, which, quick redirection, body control, things like your reining horses, things like your polo horses. And then we have these endurance, efficiency structure types, which are like your Arabs, being introduced to, endurance here in Dubai. It's totally different. They have this um, primary need to have this long-lasting metabolic, locomotive economy. They have to be very efficient at it over long distances. Totally different to these very powerful dominant or these elastic speed dominant horses. Okay, so reading your horse's structural type. So it structural type shows us clearly shows up clearly in three places. And when the horse is given complete freedom and of movement, and you watch what it chooses to do, you can very quickly understand what kind of structural type your horse is. So when the horse is for example, has freedom to usually in the field is the best option because in the arena when we chase them around we can heighten the adrenaline, but it's not a bad place. But if you look at your horse out in the field, how they naturally move, or even on the lunge, just see how they naturally choose to move. Is it that power dominant that we spoke about before? Is it the elastic? Do they look more controlled? Or is it this kind of very multi-directional? I remember sitting on a polo horse. It's totally different structural feel to a dressage or a racing. And the second thing is what is their response under load? So how does their structure respond with the work as it increases? So for example, very, very noticeable for those of us that have bought an ex-racer, changed careers, and even to show jumping, you might hit a stubborn block for a few years. And what I want to do is especially provide you some relief with like, it's actually not a surprise when you understand the demands and the change of the demand. It's not a surprise it's taken maybe a year to even sometimes 3 years for the horse to finally feel like it's understanding and it's got the strength, the stability to do what is required. So I think this, imagine if we all had this outlook when we are training horses and when we are understanding where they've come from, I think we would have a lot less frustration. And then, the third thing is looking at the patterns under pressure. So, to understand if your horse not only and has the structure for the discipline, but when pressure arises, and especially when you start to increase your training and you've now done your foundation level, but you're now increasing, say, I've seen a lot of race horses that have gone from good foundation of prelim, novice, dressage, medium, then they get to the flying changes that go into advanced medium to get that Prix St. George goal from the rider, and then you hit these pattern issues, can't change behind, bunny hopping, all of these common patterns we see and say. And then, which of these patterns emerge under fatigue when we are training a little bit more for progression. And these are very big signals that actually is the horse's structure suited for the demands of what this discipline requires. So I've got a bit of a case study here for you. Now, a horse whose structural type, can be misread, and what was asked of it as a result, and what changed when the type was correctly identified. So, this, when I met him, he was 15 years old, eventer, had been eventing, sorry, for quite a long part of his life, a good 8 years, was with a professional eventer as well, and changed ownerships because he started stopping at fences. Now, we straight away think, okay, stopping at fences, pain, or maybe he just didn't want to jump anymore. The owner that bought him was into dressage. She was a dressage trainer herself, rider, and started hitting problem after problem after problem. Now, his structure for 8 years was eventing. Now, obviously, in eventing, they do dressage, but not to the degree of someone who's fully only doing dressage and not jumping. Remember, I showed you and explained the difference that the spinal demand of show jumping or going over a fence is different to plain dressage and just focusing with all 4 feet on the ground. So this horse was also, which is a really key factor, he was older, right? His body was conditioned to this for many years. So I'm definitely not saying you cannot, um, you know, get him to change his stripes. And we did actually completely transform this horse and happy the career in dressage. But we had to actually teach him completely to slow down. We had to go back to awareness. We had to go back to slow proprioception exercises. And the goal, because the goal of the new demand was stability. He wanted to go. He wanted to just go and do his own thing, with his head everywhere, and just get over the fence in a forward motion. We spent some time, but this is an example that it can happen even in an older horse. or a more mature horse. But we have to have that understanding of what we now are expecting of our horses. So let's move on to the rider because, yep, that's me. The rider also has a structural type. So everything we've just applied to the horse, we're going to equally apply to the rider. So you, if you're not a rider and you're a practitioner listening or a vet, this is still really relatable because it's so important when understanding the horses from an performance improvement perspective. So you as a rider, obviously we have a structure. A rider's physical and neurological structure creates a bias towards a certain ways of generating and absorbing and transmitting movement. Basically, what I mean by that is if you're a naturally shorter frame and you maybe have heightened stress, anxiety that you carry on the inside, you're going to ride very differently to someone who's very laid back, maybe too laid back, horizontal with a long frame. And the horse obviously feels this. So very few have actually been assessed on themselves as a structure starting point and whether that starting point is again compatible not only for the horse, the riding, but also the demands of the discipline because the style and it's not even the style, but the actual requirements to do dressage as a rider are so different to like a racing rider or a rider that does show jumping or barrel racing. So this is the framework that I found really, really helpful and I've used in today's presentation. So as riders, we can be a stability dominant, very strong based, very powerful core. In the saddle, though, this can mean that we um, over damp movements, so we end up blocking movements through the horse's back because we are so strong and stable. And then we can have a rider who has quite a dynamic influence, right? So they might have like high energy output, strong physical cues, and this can look at like a rider that can overload a system, creates reactivity. I don't know if anyone's felt like they've had a hot seat when they ever get on a horse. You might have this very dynamic influence, high energy output, which the horse feels. And then we have this elastic, adaptive kind of rider, which absorbs really well, like a natural follower. Now, they might struggle with precise timing under pressure. Okay, because they have this very relaxed, adaptive spinal structure. Then you have riders that are quite asymmetrical dominant. They might be really strong on their right rein and be so weak on the left, or vice versa. And this in the saddle and for the demand can be a problem because it creates predictable loading patterns that, guess what, the horse picks up on. So, how do we recognize your own type if you are a rider and even a practitioner? Because I, for example, as a practitioner rider, will treat very differently to someone who's 6 foot and a man. He's going to have a very different influence on the horse compared to me. Now, that's not one's not good, one's not bad. It's just when we understand the demand and then understand our structure and then understand that I might not be suited for certain adjustments because of my size and ability to apply a force. But then another person who's much stronger, much bigger than me might actually be more effective at that adjustment, but then also might hinder with a different kind of horse or a different kind of adjustment. So there's no good or bad, okay? We all have very unique qualities, but when we understand what we need to do for our need or our desire, then it makes all these kind of perceived problems just understandable. So most riders already know their patterns. I know most of us might know our little bit of weaknesses, our issues. Maybe we might drop a hip on one rein, things like that, or we might feel like inconsistent on one rein and then the other rein we feel like very, very consistent. Now, the structural type gives those patterns an explanation rather than just like, oh, I'm a failure, I'm weak, and that's why these patterns that I mentioned here are actually good to understand. So if you are asymmetrical dominant, it's not a bad thing. It's okay, this is what I am. This is my asymmetry, and now let's do something about it. And then let's give ourselves some understanding and compassion when maybe we are riding in a sport discipline that is extremely focused on precision and balance, why we might feel like we are hitting a stumbling block. And that's the key thing. So how do these different types interact? Now, obviously I've got like a, which we haven't really spoken about, which is male versus female, totally different pelvic angle in the saddle, totally different, even through their shoulders, in their torso, in their core. Women have different, a lot stronger cores in some sense, than men, but we sit differently in the saddle compared to men as well, but also with women who have, say, larger breasts. All of these factors, types, make a huge influence. So I'm going to look at three possible dynamics. When you place a rider type alongside a horse type inside the demands of a specific discipline. So this is what usually happens as a overall general pattern. So you do get the type that really flows. They're really really a great match when you place a rider um and a horse together, and they just everything's in alignment. They can increase uh, progress very smoothly because everything is in flow. And then you get this kind of friction area, which is also, people say, compensation. So the types of that work against each other at a hidden cost. So they both work harder, but neither perform better. They almost hit this constant, performance issue. And most equestrians I see today, we're in this friction area, okay? And then you have the blocked, or like this conflict area, where the types are structurally just incompatible with the discipline demands. I'm going to give you a big example, like just throw one out there, which is like um, a big draft horse um, becoming a flat racing horse. Like that's a complete conflict, right? Just as an extreme example. So let's just go into these a bit more detail. So for when everything's in flow, everything feels great, don't we all want this? This is when you have like an elastic adaptive rider on an elastic speed dominant horse, and they're flowing through medium trot, right? The rider has this like natural flowing quality which supports the horse's elastic recall through the spine, and the movement compounds through this partnership. So this isn't luck, this isn't like magic. There is a biomechanical reason for this. Okay, now let's just go into friction. And this is a lot where we see compensations. This is this hidden cost. So you might have a really strong stability dominant rider that's on a powerful dominant horse, but the rider's tendency is to, you know, stiffen because she's so tight and she's so strong and stable, but not tight, just really stable, that this might stop this power dominant horse from moving the energy from the hind quarter to the front end. And then you might get the shortening of the hind legs. The rider pushes harder because that's how they naturally react. Their structure is to put more pressure to be stronger, but actually they end up just creating more compensatory patterns, and neither of them end up performing well. And then, for example, we have the block, right? So this creates a real conflict. So, for example, like a really fluent um, rider on a stability control horse. So this was, for example, like me when I went from racing, riding young yearlings, starting young horses in the racing field into dressage. Like I was this dynamic, like adaptive, free-flowing rider, like just, I was the horse going forward, I was happy. And then I went to dressage. I was like, it was friggin' hard. And I kept hitting blocks. I kept failing, just learning, but failing because the demands of the discipline was stability, was precision, and I was quite loose. Neither was wrong, it wasn't understanding. So let's go into the structural alignment profile. So what do we mean by this? So I've put this into a bit of a table. So four positions of the structural alignment profile. So for example, you might have a really strong alignment, and this is where the types of alignment align with the discipline. So this is this example that I shared earlier where everything improves, there's progress, everything's in flow. The horse's natural hindquarters, drive and meets the rider who's strong, grounded seat, but can also absorb that power, but regulate the power without blocking it. This is really, really, I see I've repeated myself in there as well. Always happens when you try, you're putting things in. But this is an example of like a really strong alignment. Then you have the partial alignment, which, to be honest, is a lot of equestrians nowadays, because a lot of us kind of buy horses on that have either had changed careers or changed disciplines and things like that. Might be the same breed. So now we have this partial alignment that we're talking about. So, for example, you might have this really elastic speed dominant horse. So let's just go, for example, we've bought an X racer, and then you have a rider who has quite a significant left to right asymmetry, and the horse's natural way of going is forward, is fluent, is in a straight line, and then you have the asymmetrical rider on who wants to then go in a circle. And can you see I'm smiling about it because we're probably laughing, going, yeah, that's me. And listen, we've all seen this or we've been involved when this happens. But it does provide us with some relief when we understand that, okay, this is a structural issue that when we understand what we need to do, we can help our horse. Now, the danger zone is something that I've been a part of, and it is where a lot of unfortunate injuries and behavioral issues happen with horses. And I say that because there's always a reason with a horse. And unfortunately, it is a dangerous sport. And this is why I believe these frameworks are important to start to talk about and understand as professionals. Because if we see and we know and we see a rider and a horse in this, it can very quickly lead to injury of a rider and a horse. So this is where, you have a horse in a competitive program arena, and his collection demand is consistently exceeds his current structure. So basically, like, we want this horse to do dressage because we love it, but its structure physically cannot cope with the demands of the sport. And that's when, unfortunately, a lot of issues, problems, lamenesses arise. And in some cases, you have a career-ending injury because it wasn't considered, actually, do you know what? Is this a danger zone? Is this actually not for the horse? And that's okay to admit. We don't have to, horses don't have to do everything that we want them to do. And the last one is this kind of structural conflict. So, a horse that is bred and developed for, as I said, like harrowing fields, and now it's retraining to be a dressage horse, and we're wondering why it's constantly struggling to come off its forehand. Well, it was bred to pull a cart. It's, we see this a lot in the UK. I've worked with so many beautiful gypsy cobs that spent the first 5 years of their life pulling a cart on concrete roads, and now they're in a dressage arena and they're struggling. A lot of them end up bolting. It's funny because people say to me, I'm going to get a cob. And I'm like, get a racer. The cobs usually end up being, I'm being generic here, but they can usually have more problems because we underestimate that they've gone from pulling something on the forehand to just a straight line to now we're asking their spine to start doing totally different movements of stability and precision that, if it's not done very slowly and carefully, can cause impingement, can cause pain. And it's usually why a lot of these cobs end up having these kind of, you see this a lot, this bolting, just going for it. So what the structural alignment profile is, not, it's this like profile map, whatever you want to call it, is for us to make better decisions inside the partnership that you have. And it's for, if you're a trainer, and I use this myself as a practitioner, is when we understand that, okay, if we keep coming back and we're seeing the same thing, right? And you try the training, you change the training, the rider's been for the physio, the horse has been for the physio, and you're still hitting a block. Like, are we fundamentally missing this piece of understanding what the discipline is what the demands of the discipline is and what we currently have in front of us? And it doesn't mean it's an end game, pack it all in, but it does mean that we can start to have a framework for our own safety, because none of us want to get hurt as riders and none of us want to see horses getting injured. But there's a lot of this happening, and I think it's happening because we are missing the very understanding when it comes to what we want these horses to do, and then missing and not understanding that these behaviors are probably reasons because they've reached their structural capacity. Just going to go in a little bit more here, which is this like risk trajectory. So from a reactive to a predictive. I spoke about this last week in, when you're, or the week before, when you're constantly putting out fires to actually having a predictive framework where you can start to understand that if I push this horse past now, I'm going past that demand, past the capacity that the horse can do, and this is where the injury is going to happen. So what I see is we have these kind of subtle imbalances, early loading compensations, early loading frictions that then turn into more of a recurring lameness. You see this a lot where horses are having hocks injected. It's a relief, yay, and then 6 weeks later, this lame left fore, and you're like, what? You get that injected, yay, and then the back goes, and then you're like, right, what am I missing here? We keep putting the fires out, but are we looking at the horse's structure and going, hang on a minute, this is what I want the horse to do, but is my body suited for this demand, and is the horse suited for the currently the expectations of this discipline? So we're going to go from something which I call from profile to program. So what I mean by this, and I know I need to not keep you guys too long. So the goal with this is a suitability framework that is not like a shopping list. So you don't need a different horse, okay? Most riders come to me in this danger zone. They can't figure out all this kind of partial alignment zone that we spoke about earlier. And you don't need a major career change and give up and take up knitting. It's not what we're saying. But it means that we just need to stop designing programs for horses and the partnership they wish they had. Like, I wish I had a horse that moved like Vallegro. Or, I mean, who doesn't, right? But at what cost? That's another story. But you see what I'm saying? So we need to make sure that we're designing our programs to meet our horses where they're at, where you're at as well as a rider. And that's okay. It's going to make the process a lot more enjoyable. So this is another intervention framework that will give you some more relatable cases. So when it comes to, for example, where a lot of us sit is this capacity building. So expands what the system can do. So say the horse um, just needs the horse lacks hindquarter strength to sustain the collection across a full test. So we then start to capacity build. We start to build in exercises to strengthen the horse's hindquarters so that it can sustain the collection. That's what I mean by this kind of capacity building. And then we've got this compensation support area, which is, a horse with like conformation. That means full collection will always be on the outer edge of what's achievable. So, for example, if you take a racehorse that's had quite a long racing career of like 10 years, doesn't always happen, but it can, and then you change it to dressage, and it has talent for sure, and it seems to be picking up this prelim novice elementary quite well, and then you hit a barrier when you start getting into that real deep sitting collection PF passage work. And that's when the horse starts to compensate a bit differently. If this is ignored and not understood, that actually are we reaching, a structural demand here? Are we going to that danger zone? Do we need to back off a little bit? That's the kind of questioning I want us to start thinking. And then it's that load management. So, a horse might be showing early thoracolumbar tension mid-season. It's not injured, it's not lame, it's not broken, but the signs are there. So the intervention is then to reduce the load, to reduce that load going through the horse's body, so that the horse can recover before we push on again. And that's like kind of load management. The horse I shared earlier with the Irish mare, she was like this. So yes, we were changing her, adapting, supporting her structure to um to cope with the new demand. But she had periods where she went really uncomfortable, really sore, not lame, but the rider said, we need to back off because the load was too much. So we backed off and then we increased again. And that's really important from an intervention. And then you can have this kind of constraint modifying. So say a horse has been trained for Grand Prix and whose structure is just genuinely not built for the demand. So it's actually doing Grand Prix, right? Some horses are incredible. You just think like how is the structure able to do PF and passage, but some of them can. But then it's that honest conversation of, is this from a welfare perspective going to be sustainable? Because the horse keeps coming up with problems. It can do it, but it's struggling to maintain soundness. And this is when we really start to think from a welfare perspective. Do you know what? Is this horse's just that this actually isn't built for the sport? That's okay as well, right? It's actually a relief when you get to those point of understanding. So almost finished, guys. The most common mistake that I see is that we have this kind of building capacity system, constantly wanting to progress our horses, but we end up missing the load, the compensations. So a lot of us look at it as, we'll just get the physio out, get the chiro out. That's great. Don't want to put myself out of a job. It's the same with ourselves, our body. We might feel like a bit of an issue in our lower back, hip problem, go and get the osteo and get it sorted. And then we kind of look back at our year and go, I've seen the osteo a lot this year. My horse has seen the physio a lot this year. Like, given what I want my horse to do, say it's eventing, is this right? Am I, and the issues my horse is now showing me, am I missing something here? When we start applying questions like this to the big picture, I really believe we're going to save more money because we're understanding that actually now I need to back off before I push my horse past that phase of needing more intervention, or actually do, given where my horse currently is and where I am in my season, should we do more stability training for 3 to 6 months before we go into strength training? Here's a case study very personal to me, which is a horse that was came to me from a danger zone, so risk, very, very reactive. He was a bolter. He just had a very bad past. And for those of us that have worked with horses and know that horses that have had a bad past, they never ever forget it, ever. It's always going to be in there. You can reframe and help them build the trust, but it's always going to be in that default system. Now, how we're going to put this all together is, the rider before me, strong dressage rider, right? Knew how to train horses for dressage. Very strong base, very powerful core, but the risk was that she was blocking the horse's back, and actually as a partnership was bringing out his behavior more to flight because it was dominance, strong stability rider on a horse that was quite agile and multi-directional. And so these two didn't match. Okay, there was constant friction, there was constant blocking. So this led to a danger zone very quickly. Now, I came in, changed the rider. I had a very elastic, adaptive, quite natural flowing seat because of my background in racing and because of the background that I had. Now, doesn't mean I was perfect. It actually meant that I hit a block when I got to dressage because I had to change my structure and understand if I could do it at, up to whatever level. It got harder and harder as I got into Pre St. George, into one, and that it got really hard, and that really made me question if I actually want to put my body through that. But for this horse at the time, we went from danger zone to the partial alignment spectrum. So we went into that, okay, we're actually suiting each other now as two structures because his rigidity, his agility, and needing someone to kind of go with him was what he needed. He didn't need someone who was really strong and stable because he saw that as pressure and fight, and he went into flight. Now, I was a little bit more laid back about it, and I had a lot more give, and I was a very, very loose rider with my hands, but very well balanced because of from the racing background. And this worked. This is just a bit of an example for you. So just a bit of a closing reflection for you. So think about your partnership you have right now. Think about the clients you have right now. So what is the discipline asking of the horse, of your client's horse? What field are they in? And then if you are the rider, what is it asking of you? and what is currently showing up in the arena. So instead of us focusing on the problem in the arena, the problem what we're seeing from a treatment perspective, let's start with those two other questions first. As I said, if you guys do want any specific help with this, complete the questionnaire in the email and we can either jump on a call or we can email back and forth. So far we've looked at the horse, we've looked at the rider, we've looked at this discipline today. The next week is the program. So how to build this and how to put this all together is what we're doing next week. Um, Next week, I need to ask if we can do this if you are joining live. I know a few of you are actually watching this on repeat, but I need to move to the 27th because I'm flying back to the UK on the 28th. So it'll be Dubai time, 4 p.m. UK time, and we're going to go through uh, webinar number 4. I always say this, but I've had some really, really interesting cases doing this live with a few of you that have reached out, and we've done a one-to-one on yourself as a structure, your horse as a structure. Now you guys are kind of ahead of the game because the ones of you that have joined me, you now know your discipline demand, and now we've got your tailored program to make sure that you guys are on the right track for yourself, for your horse, but also for your discipline. If you're interested in this, just message me and email me. And that is it. Oh, I've only 3 minutes over. Yes. Thank you for joining. Any questions you guys have, you know where I am.